You know, there are two things people say you should never talk about in polite company: religion and money. But what if they're actually deeply connected? We're about to dive into some really fascinating research that uncovers a surprising link between your faith and your income, all through the very unique lens of modern Russia. So let's just ask the big question right up front. Does your faith actually affect how much money you make? Now, in a lot of Western countries, studies have looked at this, and the answer is kind of meh. Sometimes there's a positive link, sometimes it's neutral. But what happens when you look at a place like Russia, a country with this incredibly wild and turbulent religious history? Yeah, so in places like the US or Europe, being part of a religious community can sometimes help you out financially, through networking, shared values, that kind of thing. But post-Soviet Russia? Oh, that is a whole different ballgame. I mean, imagine this. For 70 years, the government officially tells everyone there is no God. And then, almost overnight, that flips and there's this massive religious comeback. What on earth would that do to people's paychecks? The answer is, well, it's not obvious at all. And that right there is what makes this so fascinating. We're calling it the Russian anomaly, because this isn't just about a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet. It's like a giant real-world experiment. Okay, so to really get this, we have to go back in time, back to the Soviet Union. And it all kind of starts with this one super famous quote from Karl Marx. For more than 70 years, that wasn't just, a line for philosophy class. That was state policy. Religion was actively suppressed, it was restricted, and people were even prosecuted for it. And then, everything changed. It was such a dramatic U-turn. Before 1991, you had state-enforced atheism. After the Soviet Union collapses, boom, a huge religious revival kicks in, with the new government even cheering on the Russian Orthodox Church. It's this insane historical whiplash that makes Russia the perfect place to ask our question. So how in the world do you actually measure something like this? Well, economists have this classic tool. It sounds fancy, but the idea is actually super simple. The Mincer equation basically says your paycheck is determined by two main things: how much education you have and how much work experience you have. Makes sense, right? Well, what these researchers did was kind of brilliant. They took that classic formula and just added one more ingredient to the mix: religion. All right, so we've set the stage, a country that went from forced atheism to a religious revival. You'd probably think you know what the researchers found, but you'd probably be wrong, because what they uncovered was, well, it was a real shocker. So the first guess, the initial hypothesis, was pretty straightforward. The government's now pro-religion, people are rediscovering their faith, so logically, you'd think the believers would earn more money, right? That they'd get a bit of a boost. It seems obvious. Yeah, about that. The data told a completely different story. For men, being a believer wasn't a bonus at all. In fact, it came with a 7% wage penalty compared to guys who weren't religious. So instead of a boost, there was actually a financial hit. And believe it or not, it gets even more stark from there. When the researchers drilled down into specific faiths, they found that, on average, Muslims in Russia earned a whopping 21% less than everyone else. 21%! That's a huge number, and it hints that something much deeper is going on in the job market. But hang on, because those big, flashy numbers, they're actually hiding an even more complicated story. Things get really interesting, and honestly a bit more troubling, when you start slicing the data by gender and by age. And just look at this gender divide. That 21% penalty we just talked about for Muslims, that was the average. For Muslim women, the number just explodes. It jumps all the way to 38%. Let's just let that sink in for a second. A 38% wage penalty. That's nearly double the already huge average we saw before. It's a massive, massive disparity that was completely hidden in that top-line number. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but maybe this is just some old Soviet-era baggage, right? Something that only affects the older generation. Well, the researchers thought of that. They looked specifically at younger people, women between 18 and 42 who grew up entirely after the Soviet Union was gone. And even for them, there was still a 5% wage penalty for being a believer. So this isn't just history. The pattern persists. Okay, so we've been throwing a lot of numbers around, but why does any of this actually matter? What are the real-world implications of all this? Well, let's break it down. First, this data really suggests there could be wage discrimination happening against religious groups. Second, It shows us that the connection between faith and money isn't some simple universal rule, it completely depends on a country's unique history. Third, and this is huge, gender plays an absolutely critical role. And finally, all this research points to a really awkward contradiction. The government is saying, we support religion, but the economy seems to be telling a very different story for many believers. And that's the big, complicated question we're left with. If a nation's government is actively promoting a return to faith, what does it truly mean when its economy seems to be penalizing it? It's a puzzle, really. And it gets right to the very heart of understanding the complexities of modern Russia.